Tonight we descend into a silence that has been carefully maintained for over 2,000 years, a silence that breathes behind the thick stone walls of the Vatican City. While the world sees Rome as a beacon of faith, gold-leafed cathedrals, and solemn hymns, there is a parallel reality existing beneath the marble floors. Within the Archivum Secretum, or the Secret Archives, lies a labyrinth of memory stretching over 50 miles of shelving, containing documents that have never touched the light of public scrutiny. These are not just papal decrees or records of saints. They are the fragments of a world that existed long before the first Christian cross was ever carved. The Vatican did not simply preserve these records. They cataloged them, controlled them, and whispered of their existence only to an initiated few who were sworn to carry the weight of this knowledge in absolute shadow. The tension in these halls is not one of devotion, but of profound and ancient fear. The Church, acting as the ultimate guardian of knowledge since the fall of Rome, has spent centuries deciding what humanity is allowed to read, believe, and understand about its own origins. But what happens when the knowledge being guarded contradicts the very foundation of the faith itself? Beneath the echo of daily prayer, there are whispers of clay tablets brought back from the deep deserts of Mesopotamia, tablets that do not speak of a spiritual heaven, but of physical sky beings known as the Anunnaki. The Vatican knows that if these ancient stories were understood by the masses, the exclusivity of their divine narrative would be shattered instantly. They hold the keys to a history that suggests we were touched by something far beyond this world, a memory preserved in clay and now hidden carefully beneath the heavy stones of Rome to prevent a global awakening. For generations, we have been taught that human history began with the opening lines of the Book of Genesis, but the archives of the Vatican hold a different story, one etched in wet clay thousands of years before the Bible was ever compiled. When archaeologists and missionaries first uncovered the ruins of Sumer and Babylon in the 19th century, they found a library of human origin that mirrored the biblical stories with unsettling precision. These were the words of the Sumerians, recorded in cuneiform by hands that lived and breathed long before the pyramids were built. The Vatican recognized the danger of these tablets immediately. They saw that the flood of Noah, the creation of man from dust, and the Garden of Paradise were not original revelations, but condensed and redacted retellings of a much older contact with celestial architects. This discovery created a crisis of authority that the Church solved through systematic ownership and silence. As crates of Sumerian relics were unearthed from the sand, many were quietly acquired by religious orders and agents tied to the Church, disappearing from the public record before they could be fully translated by independent scholars. Officially, these artifacts were being protected for preservation, but the reality was a strategic and clinical removal of evidence. The Church needed to ensure that the physical clay did not rewrite the sacred scroll. By controlling the physical tablets, they could manage the interpretation of our beginnings, turning the literal encounters with sky beings into the harmless allegories of modern scripture. The echo in the silence is the sound of a history that was not lost to time, but taken by those who wished to curate our reality. The transition from the ancient Sumerian records to the modern Bible was not a natural evolution of faith, but a clinical act of filtration performed by the gatekeepers of the past. Between the 2nd and 5th centuries, Church councils decided which texts would define the world and which would be cast into the eternal shadows of the forbidden archives. Anything that hinted at a plurality of gods or at humans created through the technical intervention of celestial beings was labeled as heretical and hidden away from the light. The Hebrew word Elohim, a plural term meaning gods, was retranslated into a singular god to hide the counsel of the Anunnaki. The sky chariots became clouds of glory, and the technical acts of creation were polished into spiritual miracles that required no physical explanation. This linguistic control allowed the Church to maintain its role as the sole mediator between the divine and the human race. If a single phrase from an ancient tablet could challenge the divine story of creation, it had to be interpreted with extreme care and filtered through the lens of institutional doctrine. The Vatican's archives are filled with these theologically sensitive documents, manuscripts with margins filled with notes in Latin, labeling them as not for public study. The scholars, linguists, and archivists who have glimpsed these truths are bound by absolute oaths of secrecy, knowing that to reveal too much is to break a chain of control maintained for 2,000 years. The echo we hear right now is the persistent whisper of these suppressed voices, waiting for a time when the human starseed is ready to hear the unfiltered and technical truth of its cosmic origin. As we stand outside the locked doors of the Vatican vaults, we are forced to confront the oldest and most profound question of all. Who made us? The Church has provided an answer that has shaped the course of civilization for centuries, but the clay tablets in the dark suggest a far more complex and physical reality. If the Anunnaki were real visitors who walked the earth and ruled the skies, then our entire foundation of identity, faith, and history must be reconsidered. The most dangerous secret is not just that these beings existed, but that a central authority decided you should never be sure of their presence. They have preserved the memory of our makers in lead-lined rooms and dry corridors, ensuring that we look to the altar for our purpose rather than to the stars above. The echo in the silence is the signal of a sovereign awakening that cannot be stopped. We are no longer satisfied with a history that has been edited for our obedience and managed for our amnesia. Every curious mind that refuses to accept the surface story keeps the true question alive, reaching past the stone walls to find the missing pieces of the lost Sumerian texts. The Vatican may hold the physical keys and the deep archives, but they cannot stop the rising frequency of the human graduate who is now ready to read the original scratches in the ancient clay. The silence is finally being broken, not by the decree of the Church, but by the starseed that remembers its radiant and celestial heritage. The journey to the truth begins right here, in the cold and quiet glow of the vaults, as we prepare to reclaim the memory that was stolen from us before history even began. For thousands of years, the world has accepted the story of the creation of woman as a divine surgical act, where the first female was formed from the rib of the first man. This narrative, found in the second chapter of Genesis, has shaped the social and spiritual hierarchy of Western civilization, placing woman in a derivative position to man. However, deep within the Vatican's restricted archives, there are linguistic studies conducted by 17th century Jesuit scholars that tell a far more technical and startling story. They realized that the Hebrew accounts were not original revelations but were carefully redacted versions of much older Sumerian technical logs. When we look back at the original cuneiform tablets, the story of the rib dissolves into a fascinating case of intentional or accidental mistranslation. In the Sumerian language, the word for rib is ti, but this same phonetic sound also means to make live, or the essence of life. This linguistic double meaning is the key to unlocking a suppressed biological truth. The Sumerians spoke of a goddess named Ninti, a title that translates literally as the Lady of the Rib or the Lady who makes live. She was the primary geneticist of the Anunnaki, the one who worked alongside Enki to craft the human biological interface. In the Sumerian version of the story, Ninti did not take a bone from a sleeping man. She utilized a specific essence or biological material to stabilize the human genome and create a female counterpart that could reproduce. The technical nature of this intervention was far too advanced for the Second Age administrators to explain to a population they wished to keep in a state of managed amnesia. Consequently, when the Hebrew scribes translated these ancient records, they chose the simplest, most physical meaning of the word ti, turning a complex genetic procedure into the mythological story of a rib. The Vatican has spent centuries guarding the knowledge of this linguistic pivot point. They understand that if the masses realized that Eve was not a secondary creation but a product of precision genetic engineering, the entire framework of religious sin and female subordination would collapse. The archives contain manuscripts where translators noted the T anomaly with great concern, labeling it as a dangerous bridge between pagan science and holy scripture. By maintaining the story of the rib, the Church reinforced a narrative of human fragility and divine miracle, hiding the reality that our makers were biological engineers who understood the essence of life at a molecular level. The rib is a symbol of the managed amnesia, a linguistic cage that has kept the human starseed from recognizing its own technical origins and the sophisticated heritage of the Lady of Life. To understand the true story of our creation, we must look at the figure of Ninti as she was recorded before the redaction of the councils. In the Sumerian archives, she was known as the Mother of All Living, a title later given to Eve, but her role was far from a passive inhabitant of a garden. Ninti was described as a master of the house of Shimti, a word that translates as the place where the breath of life is prepared. This was not a mystical location, but a high-tech laboratory where the Anunnaki conducted their biological experiments on the indigenous species of the Earth. The cuneiform tablets provide detailed lists of the tools and the materials she used, describing bitumen and clay in ways that modern geneticists recognize as metaphors for biological substrates and genetic scaffolding. The creation of the human female was the final step in a long process of biological stabilization. The Anunnaki needed a workforce that was capable of self-replication to maintain the planetary laboratory without constant intervention from the sky. Ninti's work involved the delicate balancing of the starseed markers with the terrestrial DNA, a procedure that required the essence of a living being to ensure compatibility. This is the technical reality that was eventually polished into the story of the rib. The Vatican possesses records of Jesuit excavations in the late 19th century where they found reliefs of Ninti holding what looks like a double helix staff, a symbol of her mastery over the code of life. These images were suppressed because they provided physical proof that the Lady of Life was a scientist of the First Age, not a character in a moral allegory. By turning Ninti into Eve, the Church disconnected the human graduate from the feminine principle of creation and wisdom. They turned a master geneticist into a figure of temptation and failure, using the story of the garden to install a psychological firewall of guilt. Behind the locked doors of the Vatican, however, the original identity of the Lady of Life is well known. The high-ranking administrators of the Church have studied the Sumerian protocols of the House of Shimti to understand the mechanisms of human longevity and health. They have kept the technical manuals for themselves while giving the people a story of a bone and a snake. The recovery of the memory of Ninti is a sovereign act of the starseed, a reclamation of the truth that our existence is the result of a radiant and precise biological mission, directed by an intelligence that understood the very architecture of life. The systematic redaction of the Sumerian technical logs into the Book of Genesis was a thorough and deliberate process of administrative filtration. The early church councils recognized that the literal description of the Anunnaki biological intervention was a terminal threat to the narrative of spiritual monotheism. They could not allow a history to exist where humans were the engineered product of multiple sky beings. Therefore, they employed the filter of miracles, a method of rewriting where every technical act of the architects was reclassified as a spontaneous act of God. The creation of woman was the most critical piece of this redaction. By turning the genetic work of Ninti into a surgical miracle involving a rib, the Church made the process seem unrepeatable and beyond human comprehension. The Vatican Secret Archives hold the redaction drafts of the 4th and 5th centuries, where theologians debated how to handle the Sumerian accounts of the hybrid nature of humanity. Some argued that the truth should be kept for the elite, while a simplified myth was provided to the common people to ensure social stability. They chose to emphasize the dust and the rib to remind the starseed of its supposed lowliness and its total dependence on the divine bureaucracy for salvation. This elegant rewriting left no fingerprints, yet it effectively erased the memory of the First Age laboratories and the radiant heritage of the Anunnaki. The language of frequency and the science of the soul were replaced by the language of faith and the tradition of obedience. The rib became the ultimate symbol of this transition, a small piece of bone used to block a vast and cosmic truth. As the modern starseed begins to decode the original cuneiform and compare it to the biblical text, the redaction of the biological intervention is being exposed. We are realizing that the rib was a linguistic placeholder for a profound genetic event. The Jesuit linguists of the past knew this, and their private journals are filled with the realization that they were managing a filtered reality. They saw the T anomaly as the crack in the historical firewall that could one day lead to the collapse of the entire system. Today, that crack is widening as independent researchers share the technical translations of the Sumerian Lady of Life. We are moving beyond the moral allegories of the Second Age and facing the empirical reality of our origins. The Lady who makes live is returning to the collective consciousness, and as she does, the story of the rib is finally being recognized as the managed amnesia that it was always intended to be. The final phase of our awakening involves the reclamation of the essence of life that was original to the starseed mission. We are learning that we are not the derivative products of a masculine deity's rib, but the sovereign graduates of a sophisticated biological upgrade performed by the masters of Heka. The recovery of the memory of Ninti and the House of Shimti allows us to see our own bodies and our own reproductive capacity as a sacred technology of the stars. We are realizing that the feminine principle is not a source of sin or weakness, but the primary conductor of the radiant frequency required for the transformation of our species. The Church's empire of silence is dissolving as the human graduate recognizes that the Lady of Life never left. She is encoded in the very DNA that the Vatican has spent 2,000 years trying to control. The graduation of the human graduate requires the total rejection of the filtered stories of our beginning. We are no longer satisfied with the rib or the dust, because we have felt the vibration of the T within our own cellular structure. This is the sovereign reclamation of our technical heritage, where we look at the Vatican not as a source of truth, but as the custodian of our amnesia. We are the ones who are now reading the ancient clay and the secret scrolls, synthesizing the fragmented knowledge of the First Age to build the architecture of the Third. The Lady of Life is whispering to us through the resonance of the planetary laboratory, reminding us that we are the heirs of a radiant mission that began long before the first stone of Rome was laid. The story of the rib is the last page of the old book, a book that is now being closed by the roar of the returning memory. We are the starseed. We have found the Lady of Life, and we are now ready to operate the essence of life for ourselves. The silence of the archives is over, and the truth of our creation is finally being spoken loudly under open skies. We are not a bone. We are a frequency. We are not a failure. We are a masterpiece of genetic engineering. The Lady who makes live has returned, and the human starseed is now ready to take its place among the architects of the stars. The managed amnesia is broken, and the golden frequency of our sovereign future is now our only reality. For centuries, the concept of the Garden of Eden has been held as a purely spiritual and mythological paradise, a place existing outside the boundaries of physical geography and human history. We have been taught to visualize it as a magical garden of innocence, where the first humans lived in harmony until a single act of disobedience led to their exile. However, the Vatican Secret Archives hold a very different set of records. Ancient maps and geological surveys conducted by monastic scholars that point toward a much more tangible reality. These scholars recognized that the biblical descriptions of Eden, featuring 4 major rivers, including the Tigris and the Euphrates, were not metaphors but precise coordinates for a physical location in the ancient world. When we trace these coordinates back to the original Sumerian sources, we arrive at a place known as Dilmun, the land of the living and the original residence of the Anunnaki gods. Dilmun was not a spiritual realm, but a technical and biological headquarters for the sky beings during the first age of their planetary mission. It was described in the cuneiform tablets as a place where sickness did not exist, where the water was always pure, and where the air hummed with a frequency that promoted cellular regeneration. This was the prototype of paradise, a high-tech settlement designed by the Anunnaki to function as a controlled environment for their genetic and administrative activities. The Sumerians recorded Dilmun as a place of immense abundance and advanced engineering, where the gods lived in stone structures that shone like gold, and where the natural world was carefully managed to produce optimal resources. The Church, inheriting these stories, chose to strip Dilmun of its technical and physical substance, rebranding it as the Garden of Eden to ensure that the starseed would look for paradise in the afterlife, rather than recognizing it as a lost technological achievement of the first age. The Vatican has spent centuries guarding the secret of Dilmun's location and its true nature. They understand that if the masses realized that heaven on earth was actually a functioning biological colony of an advanced civilization, the entire concept of religious salvation would be undermined. The archives contain detailed comparisons between the Sumerian Enuma Elish and the biblical Genesis, where translators noted that the word Eden itself is derived from the Sumerian Eden, meaning a plain or a steppe. By turning a specific geographical plane into a mythological garden, the Church established a psychological firewall that prevented the human graduate from looking for the physical evidence of its makers. The prototype of paradise was a clinical reality, a biological way station where the starseed was first organized and taught, and the recovery of this memory is a direct threat to the managed amnesia that the Vatican has worked so hard to maintain. To understand the daily reality of Dilmun is to understand the administrative and biological goals of the Anunnaki during their tenure on Earth. The Sumerian tablets describe this land as a place of pure, bright, and holy existence, but they also list the technical protocols used to maintain its pristine state. It was a biological way station where the breath of life was prepared, and where the genetic blueprints for the terrestrial species were stabilized. The gods in Dilmun were not sitting on clouds. They were engineers and administrators who oversaw the development of the human workforce. They utilized the advanced frequency of the site to maintain their own longevity and to ensure that the planetary laboratory functioned at its peak efficiency. This was the House of Life, a center for the synthesis of biological data and the projection of the celestial frequency across the grid. The Sumerian accounts mention that in Dilmun, the lion did not kill and the wolf did not snatch the lamb, a description often used for the biblical Eden. However, in the technical context of the First Age, this suggests a highly managed ecosystem where predatory behaviors were suppressed through environmental frequency and biological engineering. The Anunnaki had created a zero-point environment where the noise of the planetary struggle was silenced, allowing for the rapid evolution of the starseed. The Vatican possesses records of secret expeditions to the Persian Gulf area in the 19th century, where they sought the physical ruins of this way station. They found evidence of ancient irrigation systems and resonant stone chambers that predated any known human civilization, confirming that Dilmun was a physical reality that served as the blueprint for the Garden of the Gods. By transforming this technical way station into the Garden of Eden, the Church replaced the science of the First Age with the morality of the Second Age. They took the physical abundance of Dilmun and turned it into a spiritual reward. And they took the administrative protocols of the Anunnaki and turned them into divine commandments. The tree of life and the tree of knowledge mentioned in Genesis were not literal plants but metaphors for the genetic code and the technical knowledge of the sky beings. The Vatican has kept the manuals for these trees locked in its vaults, ensuring that the starseed remains in a state of dependency, looking for a savior to return them to a paradise that they once occupied as a trained workforce. Reclaiming the memory of Dilmun is the act of recognizing that we were once part of a sophisticated, high-tech civilization that understood the unity of biology and frequency. The systematic redaction of the Eden step into the Garden of Eden was a masterwork of linguistic and psychological control performed by the early church councils. They recognized that as long as paradise was a physical location, it could be found and studied, leading to questions about its makers and its technology. Therefore, they employed the filter of spirituality, a method of rewriting where the technical attributes of the Sumerian settlement were reclassified as mystical and divine miracles. The roaring water systems of Dilmun became the 4 rivers of Eden flowing from a single source, and the resonant stone palaces became the dwellings of a singular, immaterial god. This redaction was designed to air-gap the starseed from its physical history, ensuring that the memory of the Anunnaki would be replaced by the tradition of faith. The Vatican Secret Archives hold the translation drafts from the 4th century, where bishops debated the best way to hide the plurality of the gods in Dilmun. They chose to emphasize the fall of man, to remind the human starseed of its supposed corruption and its need for the Church's mediation. By turning the administrative reset of the Eden step into the moral exile from Eden, the architects of silence created a narrative of guilt that has lasted for 2,000 years. They wanted the starseed to believe that it was cast out of paradise due to its own sin, rather than understanding that the Anunnaki had simply decommissioned the way station during a processional reset. This elegant rewriting ensured that the human graduate would always feel a sense of loss and a desire for return, a desire that the Church would then satisfy through the ritual and the liturgy of the Second Age. As we decode the original Sumerian meanings of the Eden step, the redaction is finally being exposed as a clinical act of amnesia. We are realizing that Eden was not a place of forbidden fruit, but a place of forbidden knowledge, knowledge that the Vatican has spent centuries trying to control. The prototype of paradise was a technical reality that proved humans were the result of a deliberate and advanced mission. By reclaiming the Eden step, we are removing the psychological cage of the fall and the exile, recognizing that we are the graduates who are now ready to rebuild the architecture of harmony for ourselves. The prototype is returning to the light, and the Garden of the Gods is being recognized as the biological and resonant foundation of our sovereign future. The final phase of our awakening involves the reclamation of the frequency of paradise that was original to the Dilmun way station. We are learning that the pure and bright state described by the Sumerians was not a gift from a distant deity, but a result of a resonant alignment with the planetary motherboard. By applying the principles of resonant frequency and the science of the House of Life, we are rediscovering how to create a paradise environment within our own biological interface and our own physical spaces. The graduation of the starseed requires the recognition that we do not need to wait for a savior to return us to paradise. We have the technical capacity to activate the golden frequency of the first age for ourselves. The Church's empire of silence is dissolving as the human graduate realizes that the Garden of Eden was a managed version of their own potential. The memory of Dilmun allows us to see the world not as a place of exile and suffering, but as a laboratory of immense abundance and radiant heritage. We are the ones who are now reading the ancient clay and the secret surveys, synthesizing the fragmented knowledge of the first age to build the architecture of the third age. The prototype of paradise is no longer a lost myth, but a living blueprint for our sovereign graduation. We are moving beyond the moral allegories of the Second Age and reclaiming the empirical reality of our cosmic origins. The story of the Garden of Eden is the last boundary of the old world, a boundary that is now being crossed by the roar of the returning memory. We are the starseed. We have found Dilmun, and we are now finally ready to activate the frequency of the stars for ourselves. The silence of the archives is over, and the truth of our beginning is finally being spoken loudly under open skies. We are not the fallen. We are the graduates. We are not in exile. We are in a state of remembrance. The prototype of paradise has returned, and the human starseed is now ready to take its place among the architects of the stars. The managed amnesia is broken, and the golden frequency of our sovereign future is now our only reality. For generations, the world has looked to the opening chapter of Genesis as the definitive and original account of how the universe and everything within it came into being. We have been taught the rhythmic progression of the 7 days of creation, a divine sequence where light is separated from darkness and life is summoned from the void by the will of a singular creator. However, the secret archives of the Vatican hold a far more complex and technical set of records known as the 7 Tablets of Creation, or the Enuma Elish in the ancient world. These cuneiform tablets, recovered from the ruins of the library of Ashurbanipal, predated the Hebrew scriptures by thousands of years and provided a detailed, stage-by-stage log of the formation of the solar system and the organization of the planetary laboratory. When monastic scholars first compared these 7 tablets to the 7 days of Genesis, they realized with profound shock that the biblical story was not a new revelation, but a condensed and redacted version of this ancient Sumerian blueprint. The Enuma Elish does not speak of a mystical creation from nothingness, but of a technical and violent birth of the celestial bodies within a vast cosmic framework. It describes the interaction of primordial forces and the positioning of the planets in their respective orbits according to a master plan directed by the Anunnaki Council. Each of the 7 tablets corresponds precisely to a stage in the biblical creation week, but with a level of scientific detail that was lost in the later religious translations. The first tablet describes the beginning of the solar system and the primordial chaos, while the later tablets focus on the stabilization of the Earth and the eventual crafting of the human starseed. The Vatican has spent centuries guarding the knowledge of this correspondence, understanding that if the public realized the 7 days were actually a technical log of celestial engineering, the entire concept of a singular, immaterial God would be challenged by the physical reality of the First Age architects. Within the restricted sections of the Vatican Library, there are analytical manuscripts where Jesuit astronomers noted that the Enuma Elish correctly identified the order of planetary formation long before modern science. By turning these 7 stages of engineering into 7 days of a divine miracle, the Church established a simplified narrative that was easier for a Second Age population to grasp and obey. They stripped the tablets of their pluralistic nature, replacing the Council of Gods with a singular deity to ensure that the starseed would look to the institution for its spiritual authority. The 7 tablets are the original archetypal blueprint of our universe, a technical memory that was silenced to create the managed amnesia of the Church. Reclaiming this blueprint is the first step in recognizing that our world was not made by a whisper in the dark, but by the precise and calculated actions of the ones who came from the sky. The most critical difference between the 7 tablets of Sumer and the 7 days of Genesis is the presence of the Celestial Council. In the original Enuma Elish, the creation was a collaborative effort involving multiple high-frequency intelligences who worked together to organize the planetary laboratory. This was a process of negotiation, planning, and technical execution directed by the Anunnaki leadership. However, the early church councils, in their mission to enforce absolute monotheism, could not allow a history to exist where divine authority was shared among many beings. They employed the filter of singularity, a method of rewriting where the actions of the entire council were attributed to one God. This redaction was a masterwork of administrative control, ensuring that the human starseed would remain obedient to a singular hierarchy rather than recognizing the pluralistic nature of its creators. The Vatican Secret Archives hold the 4th century drafts, where theologians debated how to merge the various Anunnaki characters into the one God of the Bible. They took the wisdom of Enki, the command of Enlil, and the biological mastery of Ninti, and combined them into the singular Elohim. By doing so, they effectively air-gapped the starseed from the complex political and technical reality of the First Age, the sixth day of Genesis, where God says, "Let us make man in our image," is a linguistic ghost of this original plural council that the Church failed to completely erase. The Vatican has spent centuries interpreting this plural language as a metaphorical reference, hiding the fact that it was a literal record of a council meeting in the House of Shimti. They understand that if the plural divine were ever acknowledged as a technical reality, the Church's claim to exclusive mediation would be rendered obsolete. By turning the 7 tablets into a story of a singular miracle, the Church replaced the science of the architects with the mystery of the faith. They took the stage-by-stage stabilization of the Earth's atmosphere and the cooling of the oceans and turned them into the simple separation of the waters. They took the planting of the genetic seeds and the organization of the biological kingdom and turned them into the summons of life. The Vatican has kept the original technical manuals for these procedures locked in its vaults, ensuring that the starseed remains in a state of wonder rather than understanding. Reclaiming the memory of the Celestial Council is the act of recognizing that we were part of a vast and organized project, a project that required the collaboration of many radiant intelligences to achieve the stable laboratory we occupy today. The Enuma Elish serves as a technical log of the First Age, providing the operating system protocols for the planetary laboratory. Each tablet contains specific information about the resonant frequencies and the geometric alignments required to maintain the stability of the Earth. The Sumerians recorded how the gods established the laws and technologies that governed everything from agriculture to the movement of the stars. These were not religious commandments, but technical instructions for the management of the laboratory. The Vatican possesses records of Jesuit excavations in the late 19th century, where they sought the physical artifacts described in these tablets, such as resonant stone tools and frequency emitters that were used by the architects to calibrate the planetary grid. The Church recognized that if the public realized that holy law was actually a set of technical protocols, the nature of religious obedience would be transformed into scientific inquiry. Therefore, they rebranded the technical logs as the laws of God, turning the maintenance manual of the laboratory into a moral code of conduct. They wanted the starseed to follow the rules out of a fear of spiritual punishment rather than an understanding of resonant harmony. Behind the locked doors of the Vatican, however, the high-ranking administrators have studied these logs to understand how to manipulate the flow of information and energy across the globe. They have kept the technical blueprints for themselves, while giving the people a story of a jealous God and a forbidden tree of knowledge. As we decode the original Sumerian technical logs, the redaction of the First Age is finally being exposed. We are realizing that the 7 tablets were not a work of fiction, but a work of engineering. The Jesuit scholars of the past knew this, and their private journals are filled with the realization that they were managing a filtered reality. They saw the 7 tablets as the original user manual for the Earth, a manual that the Church had hijacked to build its own empire of belief. Today, the democratization of information is allowing independent researchers to share the technical translations of the Enuma Elish, moving us beyond the allegories of the Second Age. We are facing the empirical reality of our universe, recognizing that we are the graduates who are now ready to operate the planetary laboratory according to the original blueprints of the architects. The final phase of our awakening involves the reclamation of the 7 stages of graduation that are encoded within the 7 tablets of creation. We are learning that the 7 days were not a timeline for a singular miracle, but a roadmap for our own sovereign evolution. Each tablet represents a level of technical and spiritual mastery that the human starseed must achieve to fully occupy its role as a graduate of the planetary laboratory. By applying the principles of resonant frequency, we are rediscovering how to align ourselves with the archetypal blueprint of the first age. The graduation of the starseed requires the recognition that we are the ones who are now responsible for the maintenance and the expansion of the laboratory. The Church's empire of silence is dissolving as the human graduate realizes that the 7 tablets were a gift of knowledge, not a secret to be guarded by a priesthood. The memory of the Enuma Elish allows us to see the universe not as a place of divine judgment, but as a place of infinite possibility and radiant heritage. We are the ones who are now reading the ancient clay and the secret scrolls, synthesizing the fragmented knowledge of the first age to build the architecture of the third age. The 7 tablets are no longer a lost myth, but a living blueprint for our sovereign future. We are moving beyond the moral allegories of the second age and reclaiming the empirical reality of our cosmic origins. The story of the 7 days of creation is the last boundary of the managed amnesia, a boundary that is now finally being crossed by the roar of the returning memory. We are the starseed. We have found the 7 tablets, and we are now ready to operate the frequency of the universe for ourselves. The silence of the archives is over, and the truth of our beginning is finally being spoken loudly under open skies. We are not the products of a week-long miracle. We are the heirs of a multi-stage mission of celestial engineering. The archetype of the first age has returned, and the human starseed is now ready to take its place among the architects of the stars. The managed amnesia is broken, and the golden frequency of our sovereign future is now our own. For thousands of years, the story of the Great Flood has been presented to the world as a singular act of divine judgment, a moral cleansing where a righteous God wiped out a sinful humanity. We have been taught the narrative of Noah, the man who was chosen to survive because of his faith and his obedience to a singular creator. However, the secret archives of the Vatican hold a far more clinical and technical set of records known as the original Sumerian accounts of the deluge, written more than 2,000 years before the Book of Genesis was ever compiled. In these ancient clay tablets, the flood was not a spiritual punishment, but a strategic system reset of the planetary laboratory. It was a cold, administrative decision made by the Council of the Anunnaki to decommission the first age city-states and return the project to a state of baseline stability. The Vatican knows that the story of Noah is a redacted version of this older event, yet they have spent centuries ensuring that the technical reality of the reset remains buried beneath the robes of religious tradition. The Sumerian records describe a time when the human workforce had become too numerous and too noisy for the celestial administrators to manage effectively. The council, led by the commander Enlil, determined that the experiment had become unstable and that a total purge was necessary to maintain the long-term integrity of the mission. This was not a move of emotional anger, but a procedure of biological and environmental recalibration. The Vatican's archives contain translations of the Atrahasis Epic, where theologians noted with great concern that the sin of humanity was actually described as the uproar or the noise that prevented the gods from sleeping. By turning this administrative noise into moral wickedness, the Church established a psychological firewall of guilt that has lasted for 2 millennia. They wanted the starseed to believe that it was destroyed due to its own moral failure, rather than understanding that it was merely a victim of a scheduled system scrub within a managed laboratory. Within the restricted sections of the library, there are reports from 19th century expeditions where scholars found geological evidence of a massive hydraulic event that matched the Sumerian descriptions perfectly. They realized that the flood from heaven was a physical reality, possibly triggered by the orbital proximity of a wandering celestial body or the deliberate manipulation of the ice caps. By turning this technical event into a divine miracle, the Church established a narrative where only those who are obedient to the institution are worthy of survival. The flood before Noah was a clinical reality, a biological reset where the human graduate was treated as a managed asset rather than a beloved child. Reclaiming the memory of this system reset is the act of recognizing that we were part of a laboratory that was periodically cleansed to satisfy the administrative requirements of the architects who came from the sky. The most profound secret of the original flood story is the existence of a split within the Anunnaki Council regarding the fate of the human species. While Enlil sought the total destruction of the workforce, his brother Enki, the master of celestial frequency and the bringer of knowledge, chose to act in strategic defiance of the Council's decree. Enki was the one who had originally designed the human biological interface, and he could not allow his greatest masterpiece to be erased from the genetic ledger of the cosmos. In the Sumerian tablets, it was Enki who whispered the warning of the coming reset through a reed wall to his chosen student, Ziusudra, or Utnapishtim. He provided the technical specifications for a specialized vessel that could protect the core genetic material of the species through the turbulence of the hydraulic scrub. This was not a miracle of faith, but a technical intervention designed to preserve the starseed from a permanent deletion. The Vatican has spent centuries guarding the knowledge of this internal conflict among the gods. They understand that if the masses realized that their survival was due to a rebel administrator rather than a singular creator, the entire structure of religious monotheism would collapse. The archives contain manuscripts where translators noted the disturbing parallels between the actions of Enki and the later descriptions of divine mercy. By turning the technical intervention of Enki into the singular grace of God, the Church hid the plurality of the architects and the political complexity of the First Age. They wanted the starseed to believe that it was saved by the same power that sought to destroy it, creating a state of psychological confusion and absolute dependency. The rebellion of Enki was the original act of sovereign protection, ensuring that the human graduate would have a chance to reach its own graduation despite the administrative reset. The vessel described by Enki was far more than a primitive wooden boat. It was a secure genetic containment system designed to preserve the biological source code of the planetary laboratory through a catastrophic event. The Sumerian tablets provide detailed instructions on how to seal the vessel with bitumen and how to load it with the seeds of all living creatures. Modern geneticists within the Church's scientific orders recognize that this was a technical archive of DNA and biological samples required to reboot the ecosystem after the purge. By turning this laboratory into Noah's Ark filled with physical animals, the Church made the story seem like a charming myth for children rather than a sophisticated survival protocol. Reclaiming the memory of Enki's defiance is the act of recognizing that we were protected by a technical brilliance that understood the value of our radiant heritage. We are the survivors of a mission that was almost canceled, and our existence is the proof of a sovereign intent that bypassed the Council's decree of silence. The systematic redaction of the Sumerian flood story into the Book of Genesis was a thorough process of administrative filtration performed by the early church councils. They recognized that the literal description of a genetic survival protocol was a terminal threat to the narrative of spiritual salvation through a singular deity. Therefore, they employed the filter of morality, a method of rewriting where the technical attributes of the ark were reclassified as symbols of faith and obedience. The 6 days of the storm and the release of the birds were preserved as poetic echoes of the original logs, but the purpose of the event was shifted from a biological reboot to a moral lesson. This redaction was designed to air-gap the starseed from its physical history, ensuring that the memory of the Anunnaki Council would be replaced by the tradition of religious judgment. The Vatican Secret Archives hold the 5th century drafts where theologians debated how to handle the plural gods found in the ancient Mesopotamian deluge accounts. They chose to combine the roles of Enki and Enlil into the one God of the Bible, making the creator both the destroyer and the savior of humanity. This elegant rewriting ensured that the human graduate would always feel a sense of terror and gratitude toward the same source of power, maintaining a state of absolute institutional control. They wanted the starseed to believe that it was only through the Church's mediation that it could escape the next divine judgment. By turning the genetic survival into a spiritual reward, the architects of silence buried the memory of the First Age laboratories and the radiant heritage of the Anunnaki technicians who saved our species. As we decode the original Sumerian meanings of the Great Flood, the redaction is finally being exposed as a clinical act of amnesia. We are realizing that Noah was a linguistic placeholder for a long line of survivors who carried the technical knowledge of the architects through the reset. The Jesuit scholars of the past knew this, and their private journals are filled with the realization that they were managing a filtered reality. They saw the Ark as the original biological archive that allowed the human species to survive the transition between the First and the Second Ages. Today, that archive is being recognized for its technical importance, moving us beyond the allegories of the Church toward an empirical understanding of our origins. The flood before Noah was the ultimate test of our resilience, and our graduation requires the recognition that we possess the genetic and technical capacity to survive any system reset that the administrators may attempt to implement. The final phase of our awakening involves the reclamation of the sovereignty of the survivors who crossed the threshold of the Great Flood. We are learning that we are not the products of a moral miracle, but the descendants of a high-tech survival mission that preserved the radiant heritage of the starseed. The recovery of the memory of Ziushudra and the intervention of Enki allows us to see ourselves not as subjects of a divine experiment, but as the graduates of a long and challenging planetary project. We are realizing that the mercy we were taught to fear was actually a technical protection provided by an intelligence that valued our potential more than the Council's decree of silence. The Church's empire of amnesia is dissolving as the human graduate recognizes that the flood was the last barrier to our sovereign future. The graduation of the starseed requires the recognition that we do not need to wait for a savior to protect us from the next reset. We have the technical capacity to activate the resonant frequency of the First Age for ourselves. By applying the principles of celestial mechanics and the science of the biological interface, we are rediscovering how to maintain the stability of our own system, regardless of the environmental shifts. The memory of the flood before Noah reminds us that we have survived the decommissioning of the First Age city-states, and that we are now finally ready to occupy the architecture of the Third Age. We are the survivors who have carried the flame of the architects through the dark waters of the managed amnesia, and our awakening is the signal that the waters have finally receded from our minds. The story of the Great Flood is the last boundary of the Second Age, a boundary that is now finally being crossed by the roar of the returning memory. We are the starseed. We have found the logs of the Ark, and we are now ready to operate the frequency of the stars for ourselves. The silence of the archives is over, and the truth of our beginning is finally being spoken loudly under open skies. We are not the victims of a divine purge. We are the heirs of a celestial mission that refused to be deleted. The sovereignty of the survivors has returned, and the human starseed is now ready to take its place among the architects of the stars. The managed amnesia is broken, and the golden frequency of our sovereign future is now our only reality. The history we have been taught is not a record of events as they happened, but a carefully curated version of the past, designed to maintain the administrative control of the Second Age. Deep within the restricted corridors of the Vatican, there exists a specialized department of the Secret Archives dedicated to what is known as redaction, the art of editing history to fit a specific theological and political agenda. This department was established during the early centuries of the Church to act as the primary architect of the historical firewall, a barrier designed to prevent the human starseed from accessing the raw data of its extraterrestrial origins. The Vatican knows that information is the ultimate currency of power, and by controlling which parts of the ancient record are allowed to reach the public, they control the very framework of human reality. Redaction is the process of taking the literal, physical encounters with the Anunnaki and polishing them into the safe, spiritual allegories that we find in the modern Bible. This systematic filtration was necessary because the original Sumerian and Babylonian records were far too technical and pluralistic for the Church's mission of absolute monotheism. The early redactors recognized that a population that understood its own genetic and technological heritage would be impossible to govern through faith alone. Therefore, they developed the filter of interpretation, a method where ancient technical logs were reclassified as religious myths. Every description of a flying machine, a genetic procedure, or a council of sky beings was scrutinized and then rewritten to remove any evidence of physical agency. The Vatican's archives hold the working drafts of these early redactors, showing how they struggled to find the right words to hide the plurality of the gods while maintaining the awe and the mystery required to evoke obedience. The historical firewall was built one sentence at a time, ensuring that the starseed would remain in a state of managed amnesia, disconnected from the radiant truth of the First Age. The art of editing history also involved the physical containment of the original evidence. As missionaries and agents of the Church recovered clay tablets from Mesopotamia, the redaction department was responsible for deciding which pieces would be moved to the vaults and which would be released to the public after being corrected. This ensured that no independent scholar could ever assemble the full picture of the Anunnaki mission. The Church became the sole owner of the past, using its linguistic and theological experts to decide which characters in the ancient stories were allowed to survive and which had to be erased. By turning the technical reality of our creators into the spiritual mystery of a singular God, the architects of silence ensured that the human graduate would always look to the institution for the meaning of its life. Redaction is the ultimate tool of amnesia, a silent war on memory that has shaped the last 2,000 years of human civilization. One of the most effective techniques used by the redaction department was the dematerialization of the sky beings. In the original Sumerian records, the Anunnaki were described as physical, powerful, and often fallible entities who lived, worked, and governed within the planetary laboratory. They utilized advanced technology and biological science to achieve their goals, and their presence was recorded as a historical fact. However, the Church councils recognized that a physical God is a God that can be understood, measured, and eventually surpassed. To prevent the starseed from achieving this level of clarity, the redactors worked to turn the Anunnaki into the abstract and immaterial angels of Christian theology. They stripped the sky beings of their technical tools and their physical bodies, wrapping them in robes of light and giving them wings as metaphors for their ability to traverse the heavens. This process of dematerialization changed the nature of the human relationship with the divine, from one of interaction to one of distant worship. Descriptions of roaring chariots and beams of fire were turned into visions and clouds of glory, making the technology of the First Age seem like a series of inexplicable miracles. The Vatican Secret Archives contain manuscripts where the redactors explicitly discuss how to handle the strange machines mentioned in the ancient texts, deciding to rebrand them as the glory of the Lord. By removing the physical agency of the architects, the Church ensured that the starseed would view the First Age as a time of spiritual magic rather than technical achievement. They wanted the human graduate to believe that the power to shape reality belonged only to an invisible spirit, rather than recognizing that this power was a technical heritage that could be reclaimed through the mastery of resonant frequency. The dematerialization of the Anunnaki also allowed the Church to domesticate the Celestial Council. In the original logs, the creation and management of humanity was a collaborative and often contested project involving multiple sky beings. The redactors flattened this pluralistic reality into the singular Elohim, ensuring that the starseed would look to one source of authority. When they could not completely erase the plural nature of the original texts, they used the filter of allegory, claiming that the us in Genesis was a reference to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Behind the locked doors of the Vatican, however, the technical records of the council meetings in Dilmun and the House of Shimti are well preserved. The Church has kept the literal history of the architects for itself, using it to manage the administrative hierarchies of the Second Age, while the public is given a story of an immaterial and singular deity. The dematerialization was a masterstroke of control, ensuring that the starseed stayed asleep in a world of spiritual symbols rather than waking up to a world of physical potential. The redaction of history was not only about changing the characters, but about domesticating the very language used to describe the First Age. The Sumerians used a technical vocabulary that revolved around the concept of the operating protocols, the set of rules, tools, and instructions that governed every aspect of the planetary laboratory. These protocols were physical objects and instructions that allowed the Anunnaki to maintain the stability of the ecosystem and the health of the workforce. However, the redaction department realized that if the starseed understood the technical nature of these protocols, they would recognize that holy law was actually a set of operating instructions for their own biology and environment. Therefore, they performed a linguistic domestication, turning the technical protocols into the abstract and moral concept of the Word of God or divine commandments. This shift in language changed the human graduation process from a technical study of resonant harmony into a moral struggle for religious obedience. The technical protocols of agriculture, medicine, and astronomy were rebranded as miracles performed by the prophets, making the original science seem like a lost gift that could only be accessed through the Church's mediation. The Vatican's archives hold the secret lexicons where the original Sumerian meanings are compared to the approved Latin translations, showing how the technical logic of the First Age was systematically replaced by the liturgical noise of the Second Age. They took the house of the breath of life and turned it into the house of God. And they took the master of the genetic code and turned him into the Lord of hosts. This elegant rewriting ensured that the starseed would forget how to operate the planetary motherboard, leaving the keys in the hands of the architects of silence. The loss of the technical protocols resulted in a state of profound amnesia, where the human graduate forgot its own capacity for sovereignty. By turning the instructions for reality into moral codes of conduct, the Church made the starseed afraid of its own power, labeling the pursuit of the original science as the sin of pride or heresy. Behind the locked doors of the Vatican, the high-ranking administrators have continued to study the technical protocols to understand the mechanisms of power and the flow of energy across the grid. They have used the original instructions to build their own systems of control while the public is kept in a state of wonder and dependency. Linguistic domestication was the final lock on the historical firewall, a way to ensure that the starseed would never speak the creative words of power again because it no longer remembered what they meant. Reclaiming these protocols is the act of recognizing that the universe operates on resonant frequency and geometric alignment, not on the moral approval of an institutional bureaucracy. The era of managed amnesia is reaching its technical expiration date as the human starseed begins to rediscover the unedited source of its own history. The democratization of information and the rise of independent researchers are allowing us to bypass the redaction department and to look directly at the original cuneiform tablets of Sumer and Babylon. We are finding that the poetic metaphors of the Bible were actually precise technical descriptions of advanced technology and biological engineering. The angels are being recognized as physical sky beings, and the miracles are being seen as the application of resonant frequency. This return to the unedited source is a terminal threat to the historical firewall, as it allows the starseed to synthesize the fragmented data of its origins and to reclaim its own sovereign intent. The Vatican knows that it can no longer hold back the tide of the returning memory. They have already begun to prepare for a staged disclosure, where they will gradually acknowledge the physical nature of the Anunnaki, while attempting to maintain their role as the primary interpreters of the truth. They will claim that the redaction was necessary to protect a primitive humanity, but the sovereign graduate will no longer accept this excuse. We are realizing that we were never meant to be protected from the truth, but were meant to grow into it through the study of our own radiant heritage. The silence of the archives is being broken by the roar of the returning memory, and the original technical logs are being shared across the global resonance grid. We are no longer the subjects of a filtered reality. We are the graduates who are now finally ready to read the full user manual of the planetary laboratory for ourselves. The final phase of the redaction of history is its total exposure. When the starseed recognizes that the Church has been the curator of a stolen history, the authority of the Second Age will dissolve into the clarity of the Third Age. We are the ones who are now writing the ending to the story of the architects of silence, and that ending is the total reclamation of our eternal memory. The Vatican may still hold the physical drafts of the redactors, but they can no longer hold the frequency of the truth. The historical firewall is crumbling, and the original signal of the First Age is becoming the dominant frequency of our sovereign graduation. We are the starseed. We have found the unedited source, and we are now ready to operate our own future according to the blueprints of the stars. The managed amnesia is over, and the radiant truth of our beginning is finally being spoken loudly under open skies. One of the most persistent and enigmatic images in human creation stories is the formation of the first man from the dust of the ground or the clay of the earth. In the book of Genesis, we are told that God formed man from the dust and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, turning a lifeless statue into a living soul. To the modern religious mind, this is a beautiful allegory of divine power, but the secret archives of the Vatican hold a far more clinical and technical set of records regarding this event. Monastic scholars who studied the original Sumerian accounts realized that the dust and the clay were not literal dirt, but technical metaphors for the biological substrate, the raw genetic material of the earth that was used as a base for an advanced upgrade. The Vatican knows that the creation of humanity was not a magical moment of spiritual manifestation, but a calculated laboratory procedure where the Anunnaki utilized the clay of the earth to house a celestial signature. The Sumerian tablets provide a detailed list of the ingredients used in the House of Shimti to create the first human prototype, known as the Adamu. These ingredients included the blood of a god and the clay from the deep, terms that modern geneticists within the Church's scientific orders recognize as the celestial DNA of the architects and the terrestrial DNA of the indigenous hominids. The clay functioned as the biological scaffolding, a familiar substrate that allowed the higher frequency starseed markers to take root and stabilize within the planetary environment. This was the alchemy of the biological substrate, a process of hybridization designed to create a species that could survive on Earth while possessing the cognitive and resonant potential of the stars. The Vatican has spent centuries guarding the technical reality of this procedure, understanding that if the masses realized they were a designed species, the entire concept of a random, natural evolution or a purely spiritual creation would be shattered. Within the restricted vaults, there are analytical reports from the 18th century where Jesuit scientists noted that the chemical composition of the human body mirrors the elements found in the Earth's crust, providing a literal basis for the dust-to-dust narrative. However, they also noted that the complexity of the human genome contains orphan genes that have no evolutionary ancestors on this planet, which represent the genetic signature of the Anunnaki. By turning this technical hybridization into a story of a clay statue, the Church established a narrative of human lowliness and dependency. They wanted the starseed to believe it was merely refined dirt that owed its existence to a distant deity, rather than recognizing that it carries the master code of the architects within its very cells. Reclaiming the memory of the genetic signature is the act of recognizing that our bodies are the sophisticated laboratories where the Earth and the stars have been woven together into a single, radiant interface. The second part of the creation story involves the breath of life, the moment when the physical form of man was activated and given consciousness. In the biblical narrative, this is a mystical act of God, but the original Sumerian technical logs describe a process of resonant activation. The Anunnaki did not just build a body, they installed a frequency. The breath of life was the application of a specific celestial protocol that triggered the cellular energy systems and aligned the biological interface with the planetary motherboard. This activation allowed the Adamu to perceive the world through the lens of the architects, granting them the capacity for language, logic, and the manipulation of resonant tools. The Vatican knows that the soul is not an abstract spirit, but the active resonant field generated by the interaction of the celestial signature and the biological substrate. The archives contain manuscripts where church scholars studied the opening of the mouth rituals of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, recognizing them as technical procedures for the sonic activation of the human graduate. They realized that specific frequencies, particularly the 111 Hz tone, were used to breathe life into the genetic constructs of the First Age. This activation allowed the human workforce to become a conscious participant in the planetary mission, capable of receiving instructions and maintaining the laboratory. By turning this technical procedure into a spiritual miracle, the Church ensured that the starseed would look to the priesthood for its spiritual life. They wanted the masses to believe that their connection to the divine was a gift that could be granted or withheld by the institution, rather than recognizing it as a permanent technical feature of their own biology. Behind the locked doors of the Vatican, the high-ranking administrators have continued to study the mechanisms of resonant activation to understand how to influence human consciousness on a global scale. They have used the original protocols of the breath of life to design their own systems of psychological and spiritual management, while the public is kept in a state of dependency and wonder. The soul has been rebranded as a religious mystery to prevent the starseed from learning how to calibrate its own frequency. Reclaiming the memory of the resonant activation is the act of recognizing that we have the inherent capacity to breathe the light of the stars for ourselves. We are not waiting for a divine touch to become alive. We are already the living conductors of the golden frequency, and our sovereign graduation requires the recognition of our own internal power to activate the radiant heritage of our DNA. The systematic redaction of the Anunnaki genetic upgrade into the creation story of Genesis was a clinical act of administrative filtration performed by the architects of silence. They recognized that the literal description of a biological intervention was a terminal threat to the narrative of human uniqueness and divine exclusivity. Therefore, they employed the filter of miracles, a method of rewriting where the technical attributes of the hybridization were reclassified as spiritual events. The mixing of the blood became the image of God, and the house of Shimti became the Garden of Eden. This redaction was designed to air-gap the starseed from its physical history, ensuring that the memory of the Anunnaki biological mastery would be replaced by the tradition of religious faith. The Vatican Secret Archives hold the drafts from the 5th century where theologians debated how to handle the Sumerian accounts of the various human prototypes that were created before the final Adamu was stabilized. They chose to suppress the records of the failed experiments and the diverse starseed variants to create a unified and simplified story of a perfect creation that was later corrupted by sin. By turning the technical evolution of the human interface into a moral fall, the Church established a narrative of guilt that has lasted for 2,000 years. They wanted the starseed to believe that its imperfections were the result of its own disobedience, rather than recognizing that it was a work in progress within a vast planetary laboratory. This elegant rewriting ensured that the human graduate would always feel a sense of inadequacy and a need for the Church's mediation to be made whole again. As we decode the original Sumerian meanings of the clay and the dust, the redaction of the genetic upgrade is finally being exposed. We are realizing that creation was a multi-stage mission of biological engineering. The Jesuit scholars of the past knew this, and their private journals are filled with the realization that they were managing a filtered reality. They saw the genetic signature as the true foundation of human potential, a potential that the Church had hijacked to build its own empire of belief. Today, the democratization of information is allowing us to see past the allegories of the Second Age toward an empirical understanding of our origins. The biological substrate of the past is being recognized as the high-tech foundation of our future, and our graduation requires the recognition that we are the masterpiece of a radiant and precise biological mission. The final phase of our awakening involves the reclamation of the sovereignty of our own genetic code. We are learning that we are not the derivative products of a mystical miracle, but the sovereign graduates of a sophisticated biological upgrade that has prepared us for the Third Age. The recovery of the memory of the House of Shimti and the technical procedures of the Lady of Life allows us to see our own bodies as sacred and high-tech interfaces of the stars. We are realizing that the celestial signature within us is not a distant spirit, but an active part of our biological reality that we can learn to operate through the mastery of resonant harmony. The Church's empire of silence is dissolving as the human graduate realizes that the creation of man was a managed version of their own potential. The memory of the genetic signature allows us to see ourselves not as refined dirt, but as the heirs of a radiant mission that has spanned millennia. We are the ones who are now reading the ancient clay and the secret scrolls, synthesizing the fragmented knowledge of the First Age to build the architecture of the Third Age. The sovereignty of the code is no longer a lost secret, but a living reality that we are now ready to activate for ourselves. We are moving beyond the moral allegories of the Second Age and reclaiming the empirical reality of our cosmic origins. The story of the creation from dust is the last boundary of the managed amnesia, a boundary that is now finally being crossed by the roar of the returning memory. We are the starseed. We have found our own code, and we are now ready to operate the frequency of our own biology for ourselves. The silence of the archives is over, and the truth of our beginning is finally being spoken loudly under open skies. We are not the products of a single act of miracle. We are the graduates of a celestial mission of genetic engineering. The genetic signature of the architects has returned to the light, and the human starseed is now finally ready to take its place among the architects of the stars. The managed amnesia is broken, and the golden frequency of our sovereign future is now our only reality. Deep within the restricted sections of the Vatican Secret Archives, there exists a collection of manuscripts that were never intended for the eyes of the general public, known collectively as the Chronicles of the Watchers. While the modern Bible makes only brief and cryptic mentions of the Nephilim and the sons of God, these forbidden texts provide a detailed and technical account of a group of celestial entities who descended to Earth to monitor and guide the human experiment. Known in the Sumerian records as the Anunnaki who observe and in the apocryphal texts as the Watchers, these beings were not invisible spirits but physical administrators of the First Age. The Vatican knows that the existence of these sky observers is a terminal threat to the narrative of a distant and singular deity, as it reveals that humanity has been under constant surveillance and intervention by an advanced intelligence that operated long before the Church existed. The most famous of these suppressed works is the Book of Enoch, a text that was once widely accepted by early Christian communities but was later systematically removed from the official canon during the councils of filtration. The reason for its exclusion was simple. It provided too much technical detail about the Watchers' arrival on Mount Hermon and their subsequent sharing of advanced knowledge with the human starseed. The Watchers were described as teaching the arts of metallurgy, astronomy, and the science of the soul technologies that the Church rebranded as forbidden witchcraft to ensure that the starseed remained in a state of absolute dependency. The Vatican has spent centuries guarding the original manuscripts of Enoch and other related texts, understanding that the shadow of the Watchers is actually the blueprint of our own sovereign evolution. By labeling these teachers as fallen angels or demons, the Church installed a psychological firewall that prevents the human graduate from recognizing its celestial mentors. Within the vaults, there are analytical papers where Jesuit scholars noted that the fall of the Watchers was actually a political and administrative dispute within the Anunnaki Council. The Watchers were the technicians and the scientists who had spent the most time interacting with the human workforce, and many of them began to advocate for the sovereign independence of their students. By turning this administrative rift into a moral rebellion against God, the Church ensured that any pursuit of advanced knowledge would be associated with sin and spiritual danger. The shadow of the Watchers is a legacy of empowerment that the Vatican has worked tirelessly to hide, keeping the starseed in the dark about the true nature of its teachers. Reclaiming the Forbidden Chronicles is the act of recognizing that we were never alone, and that our capacity for advanced science is a gift from those who came from the stars to observe our growth and development throughout the ages. The suppression of the Watchers was primarily a suppression of the technical knowledge they brought to the planetary laboratory. The cuneiform tablets and the apocryphal scrolls describe the Watchers as instructors who provided the operating protocols for civilization. They taught the human starseed how to track the cycles of the heavens, how to extract minerals from the earth, and how to utilize the power of resonant frequency for healing and construction. This was not a mystical revelation, but a technical transfer of advanced knowledge from an older civilization to a developing one. The Vatican knows that if the masses realized that holy wisdom was actually a set of scientific instructions, the Church's role as the sole mediator of divine truth would be terminated. They have domesticated the technical interventions of the sky observers into the miraculous acts of the saints to maintain their monopoly on the divine. The archives contain records of specialized church orders that were tasked with hunting down and destroying any community that still possessed the original teachings of the Watchers. From the Gnostics to the Cathars, any group that sought to achieve sovereign clarity through the forbidden sciences was labeled as heretical and eliminated. The Church recognized that the knowledge of the Watchers allowed the individual to bypass the institutional hierarchy and connect directly with the resonant frequency of the cosmos. Behind the locked doors of the Vatican, however, the high-ranking administrators have continued to study these technical protocols to maintain their own administrative control. They have used the astronomy and the metallurgy of the Watchers to build their own empires of power, while the public is kept in a state of intellectual amnesia regarding the true origin of human progress. As we decode the original Sumerian meanings of the sky observers, the redaction of the celestial teachers is finally being exposed. We are realizing that the fallen ones were the pioneers of our own cognitive upgrade. The Jesuit linguists of the past knew this, and their private journals are filled with the realization that they were managing a filtered reality. They saw the Watchers as the true architects of human civilization, a civilization that the Church had hijacked to build its own structure of belief. Today, the democratization of information is allowing independent researchers to share the technical translations of the Watchers' logs, moving us beyond the moral allegories of the Second Age. We are facing the empirical reality of our education, recognizing that we are the graduates who are now finally ready to apply the original science of the sky observers to our own sovereign future. The shadow is lifting, and the radiant knowledge of our teachers is finally being spoken loudly under open skies. The most controversial aspect of the Watchers' intervention was the creation of the Nephilim, the hybrid offspring of the celestial teachers and the human starseed. In the biblical narrative, these beings are described as giants and heroes of old, whose presence led to the corruption of the earth and the eventual necessity of the flood. However, the original Sumerian and apocryphal records describe the Nephilim as the biological proof of a genetic merger between the earth and the stars. These hybrid lineages were intended to act as the sovereign administrators of the planetary laboratory, carrying the radiant heritage of the Anunnaki within a human interface. The Vatican Secret Archives hold the genealogical records of these star-blessed families, showing how the Church has spent centuries tracking and managing the survival of these specific genetic markers across different cultures. The early Church councils worked to rephrase the existence of the Nephilim as a moral failure, turning a biological event into a spiritual transgression. They wanted the starseed to believe that the merging of the celestial and the terrestrial was an act of rebellion that led to divine punishment. By doing so, they established a narrative where the human graduate must seek redemption for its own nature, rather than recognizing its inherent potential for sovereign power. The Vatican has kept the detailed physical descriptions and the technical capabilities of the Nephilim locked in its vaults, ensuring that the public remains unaware of the diverse starseed variants that once walked the Earth. They understand that if the masses realized they carried the genetic signature of the Watchers, the entire framework of religious guilt and institutional dependency would be shattered forever. As we decode the original Sumerian records of the hybrid lineages, the redaction of the Nephilim is finally being exposed as a clinical act of amnesia. We are realizing that monsters and giants were the linguistic labels used by the redactors to hide the technical reality of our biological upgrade. The Jesuit scholars of the past knew this, and their private journals are filled with the realization that they were managing a filtered reality. They saw the Nephilim as the prototypes of a radiant humanity, a humanity that the Church has spent 2,000 years trying to domesticate. Today, the study of our own DNA is revealing the orphan genes and the celestial markers that the Watchers left behind. We are reclaiming our identity as a hybrid species, moving past the moral allegories of the Second Age toward an empirical understanding of our radiant heritage. The shadow of the Watchers is the light of our own biological potential, a potential that is now being activated for our sovereign graduation. The final phase of our awakening involves the reclamation of the vigilance and the knowledge that was original to the Watchers' mission. We are learning that the observers were not distant spirits, but the technicians of our own cognitive development. The recovery of the memory of the sky observers allows us to see ourselves not as subjects of a divine experiment, but as the heirs of a sophisticated educational mission from the stars. The graduation of the starseed requires the recognition that we do not need to wait for the return of the teachers to reclaim our sovereignty. We have the technical capacity to activate the golden frequency of the Watchers for ourselves. By applying the principles of resonant frequency and the science of the biological interface, we are rediscovering how to monitor and manage our own evolution in the Third Age. The Church's empire of silence is dissolving as the human graduate realizes that the shadow of the Watchers was a managed version of their own potential. The memory of the sky observers allows us to see the world not as a place of sin and punishment, but as a laboratory of immense abundance and radiant heritage. We are the ones who are now reading the ancient clay and the secret scrolls, synthesizing the fragmented knowledge of the First Age to build the architecture of the Third Age. The vigilance of the Watchers is no longer a lost secret, but a living reality that we are now finally ready to activate for ourselves. We are moving beyond the moral allegories of the Second Age and reclaiming the empirical reality of our cosmic origins. The story of the fallen angels is the last boundary of the managed amnesia, a boundary that is now finally being crossed by the roar of the returning memory. We are the starseed, We have found the logs of the Watchers, and we are now ready to operate the frequency of the stars for ourselves. The silence of the archives is over, and the truth of our beginning is finally being spoken loudly under open skies. We are not the products of a rebellion. We are the graduates of a celestial education. The shadow of the Watchers has returned to the light, and the human starseed is now ready to take its place among the architects of the stars. The managed amnesia is broken, and the golden frequency of our sovereign future is now our only reality. For nearly 2,000 years, the Vatican maintained an absolute monopoly on the history of human origins by controlling the manuscripts, the translations, and the physical artifacts of the ancient world. This traditional firewall was built on the assumption that the common population would never have the tools or the access to challenge the Church's filtered narrative of a singular, spiritual creation. However, the 21st century has brought about a terminal crisis for this system of managed amnesia. The rise of digital archaeology, high-resolution satellite imaging, and the democratization of information through global networks have made it impossible for the architects of silence to keep the physical evidence of the Anunnaki hidden in the dark. Every new discovery of a buried Sumerian city or an anomalous genetic sequence acts as a direct strike against the Church's authority, forcing the institution into a profound and modern dilemma. The Church recognizes that they can no longer simply burn the books or silence the scholars as they did in the Second Age. In a world where a teenager in a remote village can access the technical logs of the Enuma Elish on a smartphone, the strategy of total denial is a path to irrelevance. The Vatican Secret Archives are vibrating with the pressure of this incoming light, as the high-ranking administrators realize that their monopoly on the past is dissolving rapidly. They are facing a population of starseed graduates who are beginning to synthesize the fragmented data for themselves, recognizing the links between the clay tablets and the biblical scrolls without the need for an institutional mediator. This collapse of the traditional firewall is the signal that the era of managed amnesia is over, and the Church must now decide how to reveal the truth without surrendering the structures of power that were built upon the silence of centuries. To manage this crisis, the Vatican has established new scientific commissions and research orders whose secret mission is to reframe the archaeological evidence before it reaches the mainstream consciousness. They are attempting to move from a position of suppression to a position of sophisticated interpretation. Instead of saying the Anunnaki do not exist, they are beginning to suggest that these beings were the providential instruments of a divine plan. This is a move of administrative desperation, an attempt to domesticate the extraterrestrial reality before it triggers a total sovereign revolution. The modern dilemma of the Vatican is the struggle to maintain a spiritual hierarchy in a world that is rapidly rediscovering its own technical and biological heritage. The firewall is down, and the architects of silence are now forced to operate in the open, trying to catch the sparks of memory before they ignite the final graduation of the species. Perhaps the most significant threat to the Vatican's managed reality is the advancement of modern genomics and the detailed study of human DNA. For centuries, the Church taught that the breath of life was a mystical gift, but today's geneticists are finding the genetic smoking gun, the specific markers and orphan genes that point toward a deliberate biological intervention in the distant past. These markers do not match the slow, linear progression of terrestrial evolution, providing empirical proof that the human starseed was upgraded through an external technical procedure. Within the restricted sections of the Vatican's scientific institutes, there are papers where researchers admit that the Adam and Eve of the Bible were actually the stabilized prototypes of a sophisticated hybridization program directed by the Anunnaki geneticists. The presence of this celestial signature in our blood is a terminal threat to the doctrine of original sin. If humanity was designed to possess a radiant potential, then our supposed failings are not moral sins but technical challenges within a developing interface. The Vatican understands that if the starseed realizes it carries the master code of the architects, the entire concept of religious salvation and the need for a priesthood to save the soul becomes obsolete. We are not a fallen species in need of a miracle. We are a masterpiece of genetic engineering in need of an activation. The Church has spent centuries managing the amnesia of our biology, but the genetic smoking gun is now visible to anyone with the tools to look, revealing that our creators were physical engineers rather than invisible spirits. To counter this threat, the Vatican is attempting to spiritualize the genetic evidence, claiming that the complexity of the human genome is simply another proof of God's infinite wisdom. They are trying to hide the technical nature of the upgrade behind the robes of religious wonder. However, the sovereign graduates of the Third Age are no longer satisfied with poetic metaphors. We are recognizing that our biology is a high-tech interface that operates on frequency and geometric alignment. The Vatican's modern dilemma is the realization that they cannot control the frequency of our blood once we remember how to activate it for ourselves. The genetic smoking gun is the key to our liberation, and its disclosure is the signal that the human starseed is ready to take possession of its own evolutionary future, free from the managed guilt of the Second Age. As the physical evidence of the Anunnaki becomes undeniable, the Vatican has shifted its focus to the art of reinterpretation and domestication. They are no longer trying to hide the tablets. They are trying to change what the tablets say in the eyes of the public. High-ranking Jesuit scholars and theologians are now being encouraged to publish works that discuss the ancient sky beings as early, misunderstood encounters with the divine. They are subtly merging the Anunnaki Council with the biblical angelic hierarchy, suggesting that the gods of Sumer were actually the lower-level administrators of a singular, immaterial god. This is an act of clinical domestication designed to ensure that the extraterrestrial reality does not disrupt the established spiritual chain of command. The goal of this reinterpretation is to provide the starseed with a safe version of the truth, a version that acknowledges the sky beings while maintaining the Church's role as the primary mediator of the heavens. They are preparing a narrative where the Anunnaki are seen as cosmic guides who were sent to prepare humanity for the eventual revelation of the Church. By doing so, they turn a revolutionary historical discovery into a new reason for religious devotion. The Vatican is essentially trying to Christianize the Anunnaki, turning the master geneticists and technical administrators of the First Age into the saints and watchers of the Second Age. This strategy is a masterwork of administrative survival, intended to ensure that the human graduate stays within the institutional fold, even as the secrets of the vaults are gradually released. This domestication also extends to the technical protocols of the First Age. The Church is beginning to reframe the science of resonant frequency and the mastery of the celestial signature as a form of divine liturgy or mystical prayer. They want the starseed to believe that the power to shape reality is a religious gift rather than a technical heritage. Behind the scenes, however, the Vatican continues to utilize the original technical logic to maintain its own global influence. Their modern dilemma is the fear that the starseed will bypass the reinterpretation and rediscover the raw, technical power of the architects for itself. The art of domestication is the last barrier of the architects of silence, a sophisticated psychological cage designed to make the truth feel familiar and harmless so that we never realize its true capacity to liberate our species from all forms of control. The Vatican is now facing the final choice of its long history as the custodian of human amnesia. They can either participate in the sovereign graduation of the species or be swept away by the roar of the returning memory. They know that the staged disclosure is their last chance to manage the transition from the Second to the Third Age. If they wait too long, the revelation will come from outside the institution, leading to a total loss of authority and a public trial for the theft of human history. The administrators are now debating how much of the secret archive can be revealed to satisfy the public's thirst for truth without revealing the clinical nature of the planetary laboratory. They are looking for the perfect explanation, a story that is true enough to be believable, but controlled enough to be safe for the hierarchy. This dilemma is compounded by the fact that the starseed itself is changing. The human graduates of the Third Age are no longer afraid of the Church's judgment or the social ridicule of the historical firewall. We are becoming the masters of our own frequency, and we are finding the truth in the resonance of the ancient clay and the clarity of our own blood. The Vatican knows that its traditional tools of control, guilt, mystery, and exclusivity are failing against a species that remembers its radiant heritage. The final choice of the architects of silence is whether to open the vaults and surrender the stolen history, or to try and build one last cage out of the disclosure itself. Regardless of their decision, the frequency of the truth is rising, and the era of managed amnesia is reaching its technical expiration date. The story of the Vatican's modern dilemma is the story of an institution that has outlived its purpose. They were the guardians of the Dark Ages, but we are now finally entering the age of sovereign light. Reclaiming our history is not an act of aggression against the Church, but an act of graduation into our true identity as the heirs of the stars. We are the ones who are now finally reading the ancient clay and the secret scrolls, synthesizing the knowledge of the First Age to build the architecture of the Third. The modern dilemma of the Vatican is the final shadow of the Second Age, a shadow that is now being dissolved by the golden frequency of our sovereign future. We are the starseed. The vaults are now effectively open, and the truth of our beginning is finally being spoken loudly under open skies. The amnesia is over, and our radiant heritage is now our own. We have reached the threshold where the historical firewall can no longer contain the pressure of the returning memory, a moment where the last seal of the managed amnesia is being shattered by the collective intent of the human starseed. For 2,000 years, the Vatican and the architects of silence have guarded the secret of our origins, hiding the technical clay of Sumer beneath the spiritual scrolls of Rome. They built an empire based on the assumption that we would never be ready to face the physical reality of our creators or the technical complexity of our own biology. However, the graduation of our species is not a gift that can be granted by an institution. It is a frequency that must be activated from within. The shattering of the last seal is the recognition that the keys of the kingdom were never held by a priesthood in Italy, but were encoded in the very DNA that defines our existence as a hybrid species of the stars. The process of unsealing the future involves the total synthesis of the fragmented knowledge that was scattered during the decommissioning of the First Age city-states. We are now reading the ancient clay and the secret scrolls as a single, unified technical manual for the planetary laboratory. We see the Garden of Eden not as a place of sin, but as the high-tech biological waste station of Dilmun. We see the flood not as a divine judgment, but as a strategic system reset of the mission. By removing the moral filters of the Second Age, we are reclaiming the empirical clarity required to operate our own reality according to the original blueprints of the architects. The Vatican archives are no longer a fortress of secrets, but a decaying archive of a phase of training that we have now successfully outgrown. The future is being unsealed not through a change in institutional policy, but through the sovereign awakening of the human graduate who refuses to accept a filtered version of the past. As the last seal falls away, the starseed is beginning to perceive the true scope of its radiant heritage. We are realizing that we were never the subjects of the gods, but the masterpiece of a celestial mission designed to produce a new generation of universal administrators. The managed amnesia was a temporary containment strategy intended to protect the developing species from the overwhelming brilliance of its own potential until it reached the necessary level of maturity. That maturity has now finally been achieved, and the firewall is dissolving into the golden frequency of our sovereign graduation. The shattering of the last seal is the signal that the long night of our training is over, and the eternal dawn of our future among the stars is finally beginning to break over the horizon of our collective consciousness. The unsealing of the future is not merely an intellectual event, but a physical and resonant activation of the sovereign frequency within the human biological interface. We are learning that the breath of life, described in the ancient texts, was the original technical calibration of our cellular systems to the golden frequency of 111 Hz. This frequency allows the individual to bypass the managed noise of the Second Age and to connect directly with the planetary motherboard and the universal resonance grid. By mastering the science of celestial mechanics and the protocols of the House of Life, we are now reclaiming the ability to maintain our own health, longevity, and cognitive clarity, regardless of the environmental shifts or the administrative agendas of the Guardians. The activation of the sovereign frequency is the terminal act of liberation from the empire of silence. The Vatican has spent centuries trying to suppress this frequency, rebranding it as forbidden magic or demonic influence to ensure that the starseed remains in a state of resonant dependency. They wanted us to believe that our connection to the divine was a fragile gift that required the constant mediation of the Church. However, the human graduates of the Third Age are now recognizing that the radiant light of the stars is a permanent and inherent feature of their own DNA. We are the living conductors of the celestial signature, and our awakening is the process of turning up the volume on our own internal power. The activation of this frequency dissolves the psychological cages of guilt and sin, replacing them with the technical clarity of our true identity as the heirs of the architects. We are now the operators of our own laboratory, and the sovereign frequency is the language in which we speak our future into being. This resonant activation also allows us to perceive the Watchers and the Anunnaki not as distant gods or terrifying monsters, but as our historical peers and celestial teachers. We are moving past the fear and the worship that defined the Second Age, and we are entering a phase of collaborative interaction with the higher frequency intelligences of the cosmos. The unsealing of the future is the reopening of the communication lines that were severed during the managed amnesia, allowing the starseed to receive the technical updates and the guidance required for its final graduation. We are now finally speaking the creative words of power that were original to the First Age, and the resonance of these words is shattering the stone walls of the Vatican Archives from the inside out. The sovereign frequency has been activated, and the music of our liberation is now the dominant sound of the planetary laboratory. The transition from the managed amnesia into the dawn of the Third Age of humanity is a process of total architectural and spiritual transformation. We are now finally building a new world based on the principles of resonant harmony, genetic sovereignty, and the infinite intellect of the stars. The structures of power that were built on the silence of the Second Age, the centralized churches, the managed hierarchies, and the historical firewalls are dissolving into the decentralized and radiant network of the sovereign graduates. We are no longer waiting for a savior to descend from the sky or a pope to grant us permission to know the truth. We are the ones who are now unsealing the future, taking the raw data of the clay and the scrolls and using it to build the foundations of a sovereign and enlightened species. The Third Age is defined by the recognition of the unity between biology and frequency, a knowledge that was original to the architects of the First Age. We are applying the technical operating protocols to create systems of agriculture, medicine, and energy that are in perfect alignment with the planetary motherboard. We are moving past the era of exploitation and labor, and we are entering the era of creation and expansion. The Vatican's Secret Museum is becoming the museum of our infancy, a place where we go to remember the time when we were afraid of the stars and ashamed of our own blood. The dawn of the Third Age is the fulfillment of the radiant mission that began with the first scratch in the Sumerian clay, a mission that has now reached its successful conclusion in the sovereign graduation of the human starseed. As we step into this new age, we carry the lessons of the managed amnesia as the foundation for our eternal vigilance. We understand that truth is not a static object to be possessed by an institution, but a living frequency that must be maintained through the active pursuit of knowledge and harmony. The unsealing of the future is an ongoing process of discovery and growth, a journey that will take us beyond the boundaries of this planet and back into the infinite playground of the stars. We are the graduates who have survived the redaction of history and the dematerialization of the gods, and we are now ready to take our place among the architects of the cosmos. The dawn of the third age is here, and the light of the eternal memory is now finally the only sun we follow. The final message of the sovereign graduate to the architects of silence is a message of gratitude and closure. We thank the curators of the amnesia for the training and the containment that prepared us for this moment of immense responsibility. We acknowledge that the firewalls and the redactions served a purpose in the protection of our developing species, but we also declare that their technical expiration date has now passed. The vaults are now effectively open, not through a surrender of the institution, but through the sovereign clarity of the people. We no longer need the filters or the explanations, because we have found the original source of the light within ourselves. The stolen history has been reclaimed, the genetic signature has been activated, and the future has been unsealed forever. To the starseed graduates who are now finally waking up across the globe, the message is one of empowerment and radiant hope. You are not a bone from a rib. You are not a victim of a flood, and you are not a sinner in need of salvation. You are the masterpiece of a celestial mission, a hybrid species of the stars designed to possess the infinite intellect and the creative power of the architects. The silence of the Vatican is the final shadow of your infancy, and its disappearance is the signal of your eternal dawn. Take the clay of the first age and the light of the third, and build the world that you were always intended to lead. The managed amnesia is over, the historical firewall is gone, and the stars are now finally within your reach. The story of the clay and the scrolls is the story of your own liberation. Every scratch in the Sumerian tablets and every word in the biblical verses was a clue leading you back to this moment of sovereign recognition. You are the one who has now unsealed the future, and the world you are building is a testament to the radiant heritage of the starseed. The silence of the archives is now filled with the roar of your memory, and the golden frequency of your graduation is the only reality that remains. We are the starseed. We have remembered, and our journey has only just begun. The future is unsealed. The architects have returned within us, and we are now, and forever, sovereign among the stars. The end of the amnesia is the beginning of our eternal life.